Have you ever wondered why you can get close to finishing something and then stop and not finish it? Well, I'm going to answer that question in this video, along with 10 practical things that you can do so that you can actually finish your draft. Now, this is the last in a series on the writing process. There are 7 predictable phases in the writing process, and I have videos for each one. But this video is going to focus on the last phase, the phase that I call finish. You may think you're having trouble finishing because you're writing in the margins of your life. You don't have a lot of time. You've got a lot of responsibility on you. There's a lot of expectations. There's a lot of things that you have to get done. But if you're already in the finish phase, then you have written most of your book with those responsibilities and lack of time. Instead, I'm going to suggest that the reason you're having trouble finishing your draft is one of these 3 reasons. Hello, I am Denis'Thomas. I'm an author, a professor, and a licensed professional counselor. And based on my experience in those fields, I'm going to suggest to you that what is keeping you from finishing your book may actually be up here. And that doesn't mean that it's imaginary at all. These are very real reasons, and they may be very compelling reasons to not finish your draft. But by the end of this video, you'll know why you may be struggling to actually get the draft finished. So I promised you 3 reasons. The first reason that you may be struggling to finish your draft is just the fear of what comes next. After you finish writing your draft, what does that mean for you? Now, for you, that may mean that you're starting to feel the expectations of, I finished it, now what? Now I have to successfully publish it. This fear about what happens when you finish is often imagined in your head because you're thinking ahead about what comes next. You're thinking not about the actual book, but about the expectations that may come with the book, or the reception of the book, or other things. Now, I mentioned in the last stage of the writing process, the doubt stage, that a lot of those doubts will really rev up as you're getting close to the finish phase. And they're there as a protection, a way to help you think ahead and problem solve about what could happen. But as you get even closer to finishing your document, any of those lingering doubts that you haven't yet resolved for yourself may still be very front and present. If I become an author, people are going to expect me to be an expert in this field. If I become an author, people are going to want to know if I'm a bestseller. If I become an author, people are going to come and ask me advice. And what do I know about writing? If I become an author, maybe I need to write multiple books, and that feels like too much. Any uncertainty you have about what comes next will really ramp up at this stage because you're getting close to the what's next. And if you're having fears about what happens when you finish, then this is when it really gets real for you. When you really start considering the implications of being an author. And you know, as humans, we are really good at coming up with things that we are afraid of. But I want to assure you that it is a normal part of the process. Now, crippling fear, overwhelming fear, that is not. Anxiety that is affecting your daily life, that may be something that you need professional help with. But if you're just struggling with, I don't know what comes next, and that makes me anxious, that would be pretty normal at this stage of the writing process. The second reason you may be struggling to finish your draft is because you're unclear about when the draft is finished. I mean, by nature, a draft is not a complete work. It is not ready to be published. You still have a lot of editing to do on it, and it's quite likely that you may even have holes in your draft. There may be parts that still need more research. You may have sections that aren't written yet. You may have sections that are still bulleted points and not written in a narrative form. There may be glaring omissions Or there may be parts of it that just aren't working and that you know still need to be addressed. So this is probably a good time to differentiate between the drafting process and the editing process. The drafting process is all about getting your thoughts and ideas out of your head and into this draft, making it external to you. The editing process is where you refine those words and make them readable and desirable for the people that are going to buy your book. By nature, that's going to mean that you're going to call the draft finished even when it isn't complete. What is helpful to do is to just draw a line and say, at this point, the draft is finished, and trust that it will be complete when you're done with the editing phase. The third reason that you may be struggling to finish your book is because you're starting to feel some overwhelm. I mean, you've got a draft that's almost finished, but now you're realizing that it needs a lot of editing. In fact, you start to think about, oh, I've got to fix these grammatical errors, and I've got to do the fact checking, and I've got to make sure the visuals are right, and I need to check the content and pacing. And as all of these ideas go through your head, it can feel overwhelming. And if you reach even farther into the future, you may be thinking, oh, and I've got to figure out where I'm going to publish this. And I've got to start to send out maybe query letters. And I've got to maybe find an agent. And you're starting to bite off so many things that are still in the future that it can feel really overwhelming in the present. Yes, your draft needs a lot of editing. Yes, it is a whole process to get published. But no, you don't have to do all of those things today. Overwhelm happens when we start to reach into the future and pull those problems into the present. So if this is one that you are struggling with, I'm going to encourage you just to do what needs to be done today. I'll talk about that more with the practical tips. And speaking of practical tips, here are 10 to help you if you have a fear about what comes next, or you're frustrated because the ending is unclear, or you are feeling overwhelmed. Well, you know, anxiety is pretty rampant right now in our culture. And if you struggle with anxiety, then the fear of what happens next may be really relevant for you. So let me give you some tips about what to do with the fear that you may be facing. First, I'm going to encourage you to have a mindset shift. This is one of the most powerful ways to promote behavior change, is just to change the way that you are understanding a situation. What if you believed that fear was just part of the process, and that if you are facing it right now, it means that what you are doing matters. It matters to you, and it matters to your future readers. That kind of a mindset shift, understanding that this is just part of the process, and it actually is a good sign because it's like a signpost that is saying this is important. My second practical tip is to just embrace this idea that done is better than perfect. A draft is not supposed to be perfect. And often we use perfectionism to mask when we are facing fears. When we are afraid of something, we often try to make it just perfect, to get everything just right. And your book draft is not perfect. It is not just right. And it's really not intended to be. You've just dumped your ideas into a draft form. And then once you've done that, you have something that you can refine and make better. So done is much better than perfect, because perfect isn't really obtainable in the draft phase. You can always revise your draft, but you can't edit what you haven't drafted. My third practical tip is to release the pressure. You may be feeling a lot of this fear and anxiety because you have a lot of pressure on yourself about publication. But finishing your draft doesn't mean immediate publication. It's not ready for that. Finishing your draft just means you're ready to move on to the next milestone step towards publication. And there's a few. So instead, give yourself permission to revise, to change, or maybe even to scrap things later. My fourth tip to help you with this fear of what comes next is to plan a celebration when you call your draft finished. Again, it won't be done, but we're going to call it finished. And so we need something to celebrate that. I mean, you've been working on this for probably months, maybe even longer, and you have gotten to the place where you have a draft done, and that is worthy of celebrating. Maybe you want to have a movie night. Maybe you want to plan a favorite meal. Maybe you want to have an outing with your friends or a significant other. Maybe you just need a day off. Whatever it is that you choose, make it a big deal, because it is a big deal to finish a draft. Most people that start a book won't get to the place where the draft is finished. But that's not going to be you, because you now know how to face your fears and you have some practical strategies for overcoming them. So next, let's talk about unclear endings. The obvious answer to this one is to create some clarity around the ending. This is really hard because by nature, finishing your draft is just ambiguous because it's not done. So what I encourage you to do is to create that clarity by determining the point that you're going to call the draft finished. Here's what I suggest. When you have written the last chapter of your book, go back and read the entire draft from beginning to end one time, and then call it finished. Now, as you are reading through that draft, you're going to find that there are holes in it. There are missing sections. There are places where it doesn't work. There are all kinds of problems with it. That's fine. You're just going to read it through so that you have one big picture pass through the entire draft. Then what I suggest is that you close it and you set it aside for a few weeks or maybe even longer until you're ready to come back and edit it. When you move into that editing phase, you're going to need that distance from your project. You need some time to kind of forget what you have written so that you can come back and approach it with fresh eyes. So that break in between is really important. And that's why I suggest you create a finish line for the draft so that you know when to set it aside. I mean, yes, you could spend a few more days and go back and finish that section that you haven't finished. Or you could spend a few more days and really work on that part where the pacing is off. But all of those kinds of things can be done in the editing phase. So the point here is to get it finished. Call it finished. My sixth tip is also for those of you who may be struggling with this unclear ending, and it is also a suggestion to reframe the way you're looking at it. So tip 6 is that done is not complete. Reframe your expectation so that you don't expect your draft to be a finished manuscript. They are two different things and they require two different things. So reframe your expectation. A finished draft means that you have dumped everything into it and it's done. A finished manuscript means you're ready to send it to the publisher. But what if you're struggling with overwhelm? Well, my last few tips have to do with that. If you are feeling overwhelmed, then simplify your task to what you need to do right now. Often, the reason that we are feeling overwhelmed is because we are reaching into the future and we're trying to problem solve for things that we're not quite ready for. So if you catch yourself thinking, oh, I'm going to need to edit this and I need to edit this and I need to do this, and you're starting to like mentally create this long list of things that needs to be done in the editing phase, then you are creating overwhelm for yourself by reaching into the future for those editing problems. If you are thinking, I need to start considering where I'm going to publish, and I need to maybe think about sending out query letters, and I need to create a marketing package, and I need to find an agent, those are problems for the publishing process. Those are not problems in the draft process, especially if they are creating overwhelm for you. Instead, back away from those concerns and only focus on what you need to do now. What you need to do now is get to that place where we call the draft finished. That's the only task for now. Tip number 8 is to become comfortable with holes in the manuscript, those undone places, all the to-dos in the manuscript that need to be done. I always have sections in my draft that are not finished, that are usually not even written. I may have bullet points or just a note to myself to add something. All of that is fine. What I usually suggest is that when you're drafting, that if there's something that you think of that needs to be put in a certain area, that you just in all capital letters make a note to yourself. And the reason you put it in all capital letters is so that it won't blend in with the draft. And when you're editing, those will stand out to you. So you can easily, even as you're doing your read through, say, add this here, or add a section of dialogue here, or find this fact here. You can make notes to yourself all through the draft because a draft is not a polished manuscript. So any of those overwhelming thoughts that you are having about things you are afraid you're going to forget in the future, you could just put notes to yourself in the draft. I find that the messy ideas list at the end of the manuscript is one of the best ways for me to capture those things all in one place. And I know that if they're there, I won't forget them. And really, that's what your mind needs. It needs that idea to be put somewhere where you can trust that you will find it again so that you can let it go. And that makes it okay for you to leave those unfinished places in your draft. My 9th strategy, one that helps to deal with overwhelm, is to recognize that finishing the draft is a milestone towards finishing your book, but it is not the final milestone. Here's how I look at the complete book writing process. The first big milestone is when you finish the draft. The second big milestone is when you finish editing your manuscript. I suggest doing that 5 different ways, and I've got videos coming soon about how each of those 5 edits works. The third big milestone is when you submit it for publication, and the last huge milestone is when you are holding the book in your hands. That is the point that we are all excited about. That is what we feel like is success. But I want you to know today that finishing that first big milestone is also a marker of success. So recognize that you have achieved a big milestone in finishing your book. And my final strategy, especially if you are dealing with overwhelm and that is keeping you from finishing your draft, is to save that anxiety for another day. I know that sounds really weird. When you feel anxious, you often feel powerless over that. But again, if you are feeling anxiety, it is usually because you are in the future. And if you are thinking about the future, what you are doing is you're cueing your brain to problem solve. And so you are robbing your current self of the creativity it needs to finish this draft because you've cued your brain to problem solve for future things. Now, sometimes there's a time and a place for that. In fact, I love being in the future and problem solving. I think that's a lot of fun. But if you are prone to feeling anxious, it is often because you are too far ahead in the future. And the antidote to that is to reel it back to the present. Instead of problem solving for the future, use your creativity in the present to get the draft finished. And then take a break from it. Getting to the end of your draft is a big deal. It is a huge accomplishment and it's something to be celebrated. But because it's such a big deal, you may be afraid of what comes next. Or you may be frustrated because there's such a lack of clarity about when it's actually finished. Or you may start to feel the anxiety mount as you're thinking about what comes next and all the things you have to do, and it starts to feel like an avalanche coming at you. You have time for all of those things. For now, just finish the draft and then enjoy a well-deserved break away from it. then you might want to watch this video next on 5 fantastic ideas for finishing celebrations.